Welcome everybody to episode 92 of Door Chains. Yes, we are closing a little bit closer to 100, so you never know when we'll see it. Right, so for this week, it's a slightly different episode because I don't have a composer on the show. I have somebody who works in the industry, yes, and has a lot of knowledge around it, but not a composer. So this will be the same as our previous guest, Dara, who, again, not a composer. So I will let them introduce themselves.
I'm Jamie Smith. I've been working in the games industry for about 13 years up to this point, and that's mostly in a design capacity. So as you mentioned, I'm not necessarily on the audio side. I'm more on the gameplay kind of rules, systems, behaviors. I mainly work with kind of gunplay, weapons, kind of characters, designs, and so on. But mostly anything to do with a moment to moment kind of game feel when you pick up the pad of any kind of game. That's typically what I'm kind of involved in. And during those 13 years, that's been a range from the Call of Duty franchise, FIFA. So that was working for Activision and Electronic Arts. And then earlier in my career, working for Ubisoft and The Division, The Crew, and the Driver franchise. That was my first game straight out of university.
Okay. So you've done quite a lot.
Yeah, up until this point, yeah, I've been pretty fortunate. It's pretty good for somebody from the northeast, but yeah, there's a good kind of industry up here as well. There's
Mm,
lots of kind of older studios where people used to work for Midway. Midway had a northeast kind of studio, and there's lots of people that have that kind of heritage. So there's lots of studios locally, but some of them are now defunct. But that knowledge has now, moved to other people that still remain.
yeah. And do you find one thing I noticed from the industry kind of looking in is, things happen, studios close for whatever reason. People move around a lot.
Yeah, I mean, it can depend. Sometimes I would say, it probably comes in cycles. Unfortunately enough, or unfortunately enough, I've been games for 13 years now that I'm starting to see another cycle come around. So the first time when I first joined the industry, you had a situation where if a game wasn't necessarily that successful, that could mean the difference between the studio kind of closing or that franchise kind of not seeing the light of day kind of
Yeah.
anymore. And in the meantime, you're starting to get more, post-launch live ops kind of games, games as a service, that kind of stuff. But then now you're starting to see kind of the opposite is true again, where certain things are happening in the industry and there's not many new kind of IPs coming out. The ones that are coming out or reinvigorating a franchise is not necessarily that successful, and it starts to get that kind of cycle kind of going again. But it's unfortunate, and it's hard to hear, especially from a lot of the studios recently, Volition kind of included. But
Mm,
yeah, in some ways, I suppose it does come in cycles because I'd seen this, maybe 10 or 12 years ago.
mm. And that's difficult, especially for everybody involved. You know, um, I'm because the way I brought it up is basically because obviously I'm based in Leeds, and I love my little slice of life, and I don't think I could kind of uproot everything and everybody around the country all the time. Just something I personally wouldn't be able to do.
Yeah, I mean, the interesting thing about that though is that again, maybe 10 years ago, your choice would be to physically move. Like you said, uproot, move to a totally
Mm,
different location. However, since the pandemic, and for a lot of studios, most places, well, maybe not most places, but a large number of places now are either remote or kind of hybrid, and they can't necessarily expect somebody to emigrate to America or people from the US to come to the UK or kind of Europe. So that's probably been the other change, is that there's more opportunities in the sense that the jobs market, the pool has kind of increased because opportunities are now available that weren't available previously, unless you move to America, for example.
yeah, I mean, when you take that example and you look at things like both the two Ori games, they don't have a physical studio. They're just hundreds of people that work around the world. It's
Yeah, yeah.
brilliantly bonkers, but it works for them. Look how absolutely phenomenal the Ori games are, how
Yeah, I mean
polished they
that
are.
that the second one, especially, it's good you mentioned it. That second one was probably one of my favorites. Just on the audio topic, if it touch upon that final boss fight, I had the same headphones that I've got on now. That was probably my favorite, most memorable boss fight of the last 5 years or so. I would say 90% of that was down to the music and making the game feel much bigger than it actually was. But it's super surprising that that's made by a team that isn't even in a studio. maybe the audio person might have had a recording booth or something in their house, or however they managed to kind of do that stuff, but nobody would have guessed that that was made remotely.
Well, I'll tell you a story. Um, Ori and the Will Wisps will forever have a huge piece of my heart because obviously I've had Gareth Coker on the show before. I've had him a couple of times. Really lovely gentleman. Obviously super talented. Before the pandemic, back in 2019, he invited me to London to see something being recorded. And, I can put two and two together. So I went down
Yep.
and it was recording Ori and the Will of the Wisps. And he said, like, you got the best day. It was Thursday and got loads of action sequences in. The bit with the sand snake.
Oh yeah, yeah. I remember you
Yeah,
going through the sand. You got to swim through it. Yeah,
yeah. Moira the spider.
yeah. That's
Yeah.
cool. It's got the bubble kind of sound effects. That the
Mm.
spider sounds like a sponge. Yeah, that's
And
cool.
the big frog thing as well. I've never seen anything like it. Watching somebody who's so as talented as Gareth working in the way that he does in Air Studios of all places, which is absolutely beautiful. And you think of all the games and all the people that were recorded there, it's bonkers. Um, and great food, but that's but that was really special to be able to stood there. There's points where I listen now, even now, to the soundtrack, and I'm like, I get to a bit, and I'm like, I was in the room for that bit. I was
Yeah.
literally stood in the room with all these players. Obviously, I was pressed against the wall and couldn't breathe, but I was there. So it's got a really, really special place in my heart. You know,
Ah, that's cool. You should have tried to get some kind of something in the mix. A quick exhale or a quick shout or something. See if you can get your voice in it. That'd be cool.
it's amazing what soundtracks can do to a game. You know, that really make a game sometimes. There are
Yeah.
so many games like that out there now. Including stuff that I've worked on, credited on, um, that really kind of shape the game and how it's almost developed to a degree. Do you find that? Have you found that over the years working on stuff that you've worked on?
Yeah, I mean, it definitely depends on what the type of the project is. But even that
Mm,
one, I mean, obviously, I didn't work on Ori, but the
mm,
thing I mentioned earlier is that the audio and that elevates it in the sense that it makes it feel like it's a much bigger world than what the 2D kind of visuals actually portray, and
mm,
that's a really big one. We did something similar on the Division. That's a game, third person game, but it's shown in New York, but you can't necessarily access every single street or every single area of New York. And the audio is done in such a way that you can hear things in the distance. That means that a modeler or an artist or an animator doesn't necessarily need to create that stuff. It's just the sensation of it kind of sounding like it's there makes the world feel bigger than itself. That's a really good one. And then the other ones, just in kind of some other games, it's the difference between you know, having a microphone on the outside of a car engine versus on the inside, it makes it feel like you are right in with the nuts and bolts and kind of the mechanics of the car, which on the outside of that might just be you getting the sounds of the exhaust or the muffled kind of engine. So yeah, the combination of those two can really expand the kind of soundscape, but also you can get right down into the nitty gritty kind of nuts and bolts of whatever the mechanics of the particular thing you're trying to portray.
And you've worked on some phenomenal games, um, involved, like Cuphead. Chris Madigan's score for that is just bonkers. You could never imagine things like Cuphead or Ori to have a different soundtrack to what they already have. How was working on Cuphead?
Well, unfortunately, I didn't work on Cuphead, but I did manage to meet some of those folks. Just like you said, you met,
Mm,
just from some of the composers on that particular project. That was a chat into some of the team and their
mm,
animation kind of side and some of the
mm,
things that they were doing in kind of gameplay. And I was mapping out their progression and their difficulty across the game and how it kind of peaks and troughs.
mm.
And you get the same thing with the music in the game as well, where on some levels it's a bit more mellow, some levels it's a bit more upbeat. You get the kind of the big brass band, kind of
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
punctuating throughout. But when you come across those kind of games, and I've looked at a lot of the behind the scenes stuff. I've chatted to
Yeah.
the team kind of directly.
So you've kind of been
They're just
assisting them.
Yeah, and exactly. I've just been on the sidelines. I wasn't necessarily on the project. I mean, that was a team that's based in, I think, the States or kind of Canada. They're definitely across the other side of the Atlantic. But just chatting to some of those folks, and especially when they've been to some kind of festivals, that they're really interested in just conveying that authenticity of that particular era, and then doing it in such a way that it brings it to the kind of the forefront. So you see that in the animations, where the animations are looped in such a way that you can ramp up and down the difficulty of projectiles, but also that could be used to ramp up and down the audio that you hear with those associated kind of projectiles. So it creates that kind of unique effect. But yeah, unfortunately, the closest I got to working on that was just chatting to the team.
And invited. Um, and did you have a part in Hood as well?
Yeah. So that's one. It came out a couple of years ago now, just at the start of the pandemic, and that was a third person medieval style game where the idea is that you're playing a band of kind of merry men, sneak into a castle, steal some gold, and then you kind of escape.
Yeah.
But there is also another opposing team that's trying to do the same objective as you, and the castle itself, where the gold is, that's guarded by various kind of medieval knights and a big Game of Thrones kind of style characters and things. But the main takeaway from that one was that we were working on bow and arrow kind of mechanics, and the sensation, when it comes to audio, when most people think of a bow and arrow, what they think of is a couple of sticks of wood and some feathers, and in real life you would never actually hear that stuff. I mean, even if you go in a forest and fire a bow, you physically won't really hear the arrow kind of itself. You might hear the twang of the bow itself, but you won't necessarily hear the arrow. So in a game that's competitive, and knowing that you could potentially die in one or two shots, knowing that there is an arrow coming towards you is pretty important. So we put a lot of emphasis on making things much higher in the soundscape, making it sound like that you weren't necessarily firing an arrow, but you were firing something like a hammer. So when the arrow used to land next to you, the way I used to describe it is the old Strongbow adverts that used to have Johnny Vaughan in them, and the arrow used to land in the bar right next to him. That was almost the sample of the basis for where we wanted to go, because it sounds like a sledgehammer. It doesn't sound like an arrow. But yeah, it also means it feels more impactful when it kind of lands as well.
Yeah. I have been told to tell you this by my best friend that she absolutely loves Hood. And yeah,
Nice.
it's such a great game. I really enjoy playing it as well. And I'm not massively kind of those kind of games, and just for me, it was just fantastic. So yeah,
Oh, that's great. Yeah, I mean, just in general, I chatted to a few people, just from different studios, and people I've worked with that really enjoyed, especially the bow and arrow mechanics. But
Mhm.
the reason I bring that up particular, and especially hearing that kind of feedback's great as well, because at the time you had pretty big, high profile, what you'd consider bow and arrow games, The Last of Us, Horizon, and Tomb Raider, which had multiple kind of iterations. And on the topic of Tomb Raider, I had worked previously with Pete Conley, and Pete Conley did all the
Yes.
soundtracks for the original kind of Tomb Raiders. I used to work with him at Ubisoft. But again, that feedback's always great to hear. I really enjoyed that project in general.
And with the work that you do, how much kind of input, kind of, or conversation do you have with the kind of composers or the audio people?
Yeah, it depends on the team makeup, but so normally I'd be part of what would be considered a feature team. So a feature team is working on something specific, and you are multidisciplined. So I'm a designer, but I might be working with an animator, a programmer, an audio person, an interface person, an animator, and so on. And when I say feature, the bow example that we said earlier, that would be a feature, or the character, or a car, or wherever it may be. And then working with them in general, audio people are probably some of my favorite people to work with across all projects. I've never had a bad experience ever working with anybody in audio, but secondly, they elevate things in such a way that you can take something that's a basic idea, let's say a gun, and they can add some audio to it, and the gun feels like it's dealing double damage, but everything is exactly the same. The only thing that's changed is maybe the sound effect. Instead of using a stock sound, they've replaced it with something kind of more final or more representative, and that's always been pretty cool. And the other one that people don't often chat about is I have this kind of weird niche that I've been working on for the past 12 years or so, which is that I've been involved in haptics and rumble on the gamepad over the last several generations, including the DualSense, the latest gamepad. Typically, that is something that is also around the audio department. because a lot of the haptics that you're using, especially on the DualSense, not always, but can be derived directly from the audio themselves. So, that would be me working with an audio person to kind of integrate that, or to try and get them to give me a sample that I can kind of use as a basis, for creating a certain sensation in the pad.
That's amazing because I've got a PS5, and I think for me, kind of a lot of times it's not really used. The haptics are not used. The only things I've really seen them being used in that I've played is Astrobot, his Playroom, and then Bramble.
Yeah.
Bramble uses it like the best I've ever seen it. It's phenomenal. They use microphone feedback, they use it for audio. It's so, so good. It's brilliantly done. And also, I don't know whether you've seen the trailer for Bramble. Or sorry,
No.
not the trailer. There's a demo for Bramble, and the demo made me cry. Only because
Yeah.
the audio is so good. There's a piece of music in the game, and you hear it a couple of times. It's just beautiful. Apparently, it's an old like kids song or kind of something like that. But I highly recommend. Highly recommend Bramble.
Yes.
I finished it.
That sounds cool.
Mm. And
Yeah,
it's nice to
I've
see
had a few
like
people
used
kind of
audio.
recommending it.
Yeah,
Yeah.
but it's really nice to see audio being used in that kind of way because a lot of times it's just not. Do you find
Yeah,
that?
yeah. Well, it's interesting because you go back a few years and there's kind of this joke that people say in the industry where they say you make the game and then don't worry, we'll just slap the audio on kind of at the end, and you've heard that in kind of previous conversations with composers and stuff of how it used to be perceived. And actually, like for me, it's one of, if not the most important kind of discipline outside of maybe something like an animation, because a floating kind of character that doesn't move, you notice a big difference when there's a walk cycle. But it's also the same thing when you've got the audio, and even those examples that you mentioned, just about games that aren't using the haptics kind of too much, or the ones that kind of elevate that. There's a couple of good tests that you can try in terms of the sensation of the experience. The first one is put some headphones on and then play a game that has some good haptics, just like you mentioned with Astrobot. Then, after a few moments, put the headphones on mute or take them off, and then just watch what the pad is kind of doing, because the pad doesn't ever feel that great unless the audio is kind of complementing that kind of feeling, and vice versa. And it's the same as true in Returnal. The feeling that they get from a plausible alien kind of planet on the gamepad in isolation feels okay, but with the audio, it kind of elevates it to make it feel like you're in a completely different place. And there's some other kind of uses of that as well. As I don't think it's in the latest Last of Us, and I'd have to try it because it's a previous gen, but they used to have this cool effect where there would be the audio from the lightning in the distance, and then 2 seconds later you would get the rumble on the pad from the thunder, or vice versa. It would do that kind of thing. And it's just that kind of consideration for when audio gets implemented and then how it can amplify a certain feeling in the game. It's not something that you can just slap in the last 2 months of development and just hit and hope. It's something that has to be done really well. And then the other one is there's a really good game. Not everybody made like driving games, but this WRC9 is on PS5. And when people say the absence of silence, of sound or silence is deafening, that kind of feeling, one of the things that they do is they have very, very harsh haptics on the gamepad, along with the audio, because it's a rally game, so you're driving across rough terrain, rough surfaces. But when you drive on tarmac, the audio and the haptics completely disappear, and it gives you the complete opposite sensation of what people would normally kind of expect. And sometimes that's another thing that's not kind of maintained enough as well. As sometimes just a pause is pretty good, or sometimes silence is just as kind of deafening.
It, it it just boggles my mind the amount of kind of work that goes into the audio for games and what people are doing. And I interviewed about Bramble, and they were doing literally recording stuff and implementing it into the game 2 days before it was going out. Because they were like,
Yeah.
I can't have this one sound here and then not have it for the rest of it. So they have to go and record loads of things and put it back in. Just the tiniest little details. It's phenomenal.
Yeah, it's good. It's good for that stuff, but also it can depend on, if it's a team's first time kind of doing that, or sometimes it might be, if you think of something like Call of Duty, they have whole systems that they've relied on that have been created over many years. So they have the almost like the slots for the pegs to kind of plug into, and that's great. It's already exposed to audio designers. They can create new assets and kind of plug them in. However, if it's a much smaller team, potentially even remote teams, it's their first project, it's a new IP. A lot of that stuff might not, that groundwork might not necessarily exist. So even just building that groundwork, which is not for the players' benefit, it's for the team's benefit. That in itself is a significant investment as well.
So you mentioned that you've been in the industry for like 12, 13 years now, and
Yep.
you started on the driver series.
Uh,
How how different is it from then to now, from working in the industry now? And how different are you?
it's a broad question just about the industry kind of side because I think at that time I joined that project towards the tail end during production. So in terms of kind of the phases, that's the phase where everything is basically going into the game and you're trying to build out the city. It's a big open world driving game. There's already 5 cars in the game. Now we're looking to make it 50. There's already 10 areas in the game. Now we're making to look at, 20. So building out that kind of side. But in some ways that's the kind of the painting by numbers, what would call kind of waterfall approach, which is, you start building a house and it takes you that long to build the foundation and it takes you several years to kind of get there, that several other of your kind of competitors have leapfrogged you in that particular time because you took so long to build it. And when I say build it, it could be that you didn't want a house, you wanted a tent. You just wanted shelter from the elements, but you didn't necessarily need the giant kind of condo on the mountaintop. You just needed a quick shelter. So I think that's the thing that more and more studios are coming around to now, which is more of an agile kind of approach. You don't need a car. You just need something to get you from A to B faster. So will a skateboard do? Cool. Well, how quickly can we make a skateboard? If is that skateboard fun to use and so on. So I think more and more companies are coming around to that kind of way of thinking, but big established kind of franchises, they struggle to kind of get out that mindset. And then just on my side, I've just been fortunate enough to work with a bunch of people across the board who are not only extremely talented, but they're people that maybe 6 months, a year, a few years before I joined the industry, I was playing kind of all of their games. When I first met Pete Connolly, I didn't know it was Pete Connolly, but then I soon found out it was the guy who did all the Tomb Raider stuff. And then I ended up just talking to him all the time. And then it was funny. The first time I'd met him was in Newcastle. We worked on the Driver franchise together, along with John Vincent. So John Vincent's audio director at Rare at the moment. So he's been there for the past 10
Oh, wow.
years. So yeah, and then those are two people they'd already worked on. I think John had worked on Conflict Desert Storm, which I really used to love, and then Pete had worked on the Tomb Raider franchise. And funnily enough, the next 2 times I saw them, Pete, I was on a project working in Leon on another driving game, and I randomly came across him in a broom cupboard because he was the audio director of that project, and he just had his own kind of mini office in there that I didn't even know he'd basically traveled to France, caught him in the middle of nowhere. And then, for John, I've only caught up with him kind of once or twice, but he's been working on Sea of Thieves and, a bunch of stuff like Rare kind of since. The last I saw him was at football kind of tournaments, again, just randomly.
And Sea of Thieves is huge. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly, and especially he's been on it. I think near enough from the start. I don't know if he's on it anymore, but he's basically been there since inception, as far as I'm aware.
So I know things have been slightly different over the last few years with the pandemic. How have you found, has that changed anything for you about how you work? Obviously you mentioned about remote working, etc. Has it changed anything for you?
Kind of yes and no. So my previous roles before so I was at Sumo Digital before People Can Fly. So I'm currently working at People Can Fly, and before Sumo, I'd been working for Electronic Arts remotely on the FIFA franchise, and that was a post-launch kind of live ops project,
Yeah.
while simultaneously working in another job in academia where a couple of days a week we could work from home. So the combination of those two things of kind of juggling tasks to deadlines remotely at different times of day because on the FIFA franchise, they're based in Canada. So it's kind of -5 hours. So knowing, when they're going to be awake and stuff, I'd already had experience of that. And it was the same at Ubisoft. Ubisoft is a company that is cross studio, cross time zone kind of experience. Therefore, they're pretty much working remotely because the Newcastle studio could be working with Romania, could be working with Singapore, and so on. So by the time it came around, it didn't affect me too much because I'd had that experience. But certainly, I would say there was a dip in kind of production as everybody's trying to get their kind of home equipment kind of set up. People now getting used to, video calls exactly as we're kind of having, how you communicate with each other, the types of kind of conversations that you'd have randomly in the studio. Now they feel a little bit more forced because you're trying to tap somebody in the shoulder to ask them if you can ping them on Slack and so on. But in general, it hasn't really affected me too much personally, but seeing how it's affected kind of projects as a whole, it definitely there's been, both positives and negatives.
No, at the time when it kind of kicked off and lockdown started, I was actually working for an ISP.
Oh yeah, yep.
I've never seen it like that. It went absolutely crackers. We had to turn the phones off because at certain points because we just couldn't handle the sheer volume of calls that were coming in because people were calling in because they wanted to get their highest internet, fastest internet they wanted, and it was just like, oh my God. So yeah, hell.
Yeah, especially with the demand going through the roof of, typical kind of bandwidth for people as outside of companies. I don't know where it'll have been, but I imagine it probably went up kind of tenfold, instantly for
like there was times we had
every
over
person.
1,000 people in the queue.
That's
1,000 people trying
crazy.
to get
Yeah,
through.
yeah.
Just wasn't possible. I'd sit in my little office and just watch the queue, and I was like, oh God. So you just had to turn them off, as
Yeah,
well. We couldn't physically do anything better, you know. So
yeah.
I mean,
I mean,
yeah,
it was hard enough just getting people's kind of equipment kind of home. And, on that point, actually, it's interesting. I said the positives and negatives, but for some people, they might get the benefit of maybe the commute is kind of easier for them. So for me, it used to be a 45-minute, 50-minute commute, there and then back. So maybe close to an hour and a half every day. But some people used to rely on the studio because the studio had absolutely rapid, one gigabyte internet, and their home only had maybe 30 megabytes. So now they can do things in a fraction of the time, or maybe it's a little bit unstable. Maybe they have a dodgy kind of Wi-Fi, and even things like that. Again, come back to audio.
yeah,
I wouldn't say audio files are the biggest kind of files unless they're uncompressed.
right,
But when you're getting thousands of things kind of coming through, that starts to add up.
yeah. I mean, I have to admit, like I work in an office, but I work from home 3 days a week now. And before I was given the option, I was like, just come into the office every day. It's just easier. And
Yeah,
now I'm like,
yeah,
I love my days at home. I love my
yeah,
days at home because hell is other people, quite frankly, on buses, because I don't drive, and there's, not brilliant parking at work as well. So it's buses into work and people are hell, quite frankly.
yeah.
I was saying to somebody else earlier on, I went out, not last Friday, the Friday before, and I got the bus into 10 because I work at home on a Friday. So I got the bus into 10 after work. And there was three separate people on FaceTime with no headphones the whole way in hell, you know. In relation to kind of people and their behaviors on public transport, we are regressing rapidly, you know. I've seen people vaping, the kids with their music on, even though they've got headphones, and it's like, oh, I hate it, you know. So I'm definitely
Yeah,
going to start
yeah.
learning to drive again, I think.
No, it definitely should. I mean, the one thing I do find, especially with public transport, is more for Dave, even from a games point of view, is whether it be reviews or you said earlier, they're not using headphones. That's exactly the one time where I would want to kind of tune in a lot more, especially on the
Mhm.
audio side, whether it be to a soundtrack or maybe it's a video about a particular game or something. But yeah, to have multiple people on FaceTime within a close proximity. I don't know how you could have any kind of practical conversation.
No, Well, done is done.
Yeah.
So normally I ask this kind of towards the end of an interview, to a composer, and I'm going to ask you as well anyway. And I am well aware of this industry and NDAs, etc. But is there anything exciting that you're working on or something that you're working on that you're really excited about? Talk about?
Yeah, I mean, the only things I can say, I mean, I find with a lot of people, it's how do you worm out the way of the NDA kind of question. But in general, I currently work for People Can Fly, and on People Can Fly's website, there is a whole bunch of information about the projects that are currently out in the open. In terms of, there's not a whole load of information. I don't want to say too much in case I get it wrong. But if anybody goes onto that, just there's a company strategy document, and that represents all of the stuff that's currently in progress. The one that has been announced most recently, but I'm not involved in it, is Bulletstorm VR. So I think they're doing
Oh,
that soon enough.
my
Yeah,
God,
yeah,
I have to play that. That would be
yeah,
absolutely awesome. I couldn't believe it when that dropped. I watched the trailer and I was like, you
yeah.
know,
It's great.
oh, I think
Yeah,
the current iteration of PSVR 2 is phenomenal. It's unfortunate because like I had the day off today, as I mentioned to you earlier, and I would love to have been able to sat there and play some VR, but it's like 20 out something degrees out. I can't sit there and slap that on my head for an hour, you know?
yeah, exactly. And that's one thing you have to consider as well as, when you say about the weather, but for different kind of platforms, different devices, if you're going to hear something, I mean, again, bringing it back to audio, if you're going to hear something kind of hundreds of thousands of times, it needs to sound good. If you're only going to hear something for 15 or 20 minutes with a VR headset on your head, probably not kind of a big deal, but it also depends on what's the type of experience you're going for. A mobile game is going to be 30 seconds long. How do you make the audio and that as impactful as a 20-minute Call of Duty match versus a 7-hour session on kind of World of Warcraft with or without a VR headset, with or without headphones, with or without V 5.1 kind of setups and so on. But but unfortunately for me is that I get really motion sick with VR.
Oh,
But that
really?
would be my perfect. Yeah. I get really bad with it, unfortunately. And some people say you just got to persevere. Or if I only had a couple of hours free in a day,
Mhm.
to have a bad experience for those first 20 minutes is not worth the suffering for the remaining kind of hour and a half.
Yeah, I mean, I'm all right with it. I'm playing Call of the Mountain, and I don't have an issue with heights or anything, but it makes me sweat. It's
Oh
just
yeah.
like because you're climbing up on these tiny little ledges, and going across these little ropes, and then you have to jump across things, and it's like, but really, going back to the kind of mobile stuff that you mentioned, I interviewed Salah Hakula recently, various episodes ago. She did the soundtrack for a mobile game called Merge Mansion, and actually that was my most played album of last year on Spotify.
Oh, nice.
It's an
That's cool.
app. If I recommend it to anybody, Merge Mansion, such a fantastic little soundtrack, and it's gloriously adorable.
Oh, nice. Oh, that's cool. I've not listened to that. My go-to is the Demon Souls remake soundtrack, but specifically Maiden of Astria, I think she's called. Terrible boss fight, but amazing soundtrack. I think it's one of the best boss themes, but the fight itself is a little bit underwhelming.
I'm gonna go and listen to that now. Right. Last thing to do is just say massive thank you to you for being on the show. It's a real honor. And best of luck with everything that's coming out and everything in the future.
Thanks very much again. Cheers for chatting, and yeah, I always listen in my morning walks. So yeah, keep it up.
Thank you.